Howdy, folks. Today we are continuing the series on the creatures that trout eat and how to translate that knowledge into successful fly tying and fly fishing. The subject of today's show is the caddis. I honestly didn't expect this one to be as interesting as the mayfly, but I was happily surprised by what I learned. My guest is Kyle Bratcher, a regional fish biologist and owner of Sickfoot Flies, a custom fly tying business. Now, let's get to it. So you spent some time down in Hell's Canyon this weekend and did some bass fishing, little trout fishing, all fly stuff?
Yeah. Just a quick little trip in.
And you were throwing clousers.
A bunny clouser.
A bunny clouser?
Uh-huh.
What makes it a bunny clouser?
A bunny strip.
Okay.
So typically you tie a clouser with a dumbbell eye and then it's just a bucktail. And so it'd be
two
white,
different colors.
white bucktail on one side and then another color on the top side. And then sometimes you throw a little flash in there, but this is just, so instead of white bucktail, it's a white bunny strip.
Huh.
And then I used bucktail for the other part and they liked it.
Were there any bugs hatching?
A few caddis.
Let's talk about caddis.
Yeah.
This is the caddis episode.
The caddis episode of the Six Ranch podcast.
So welcome back. I'm here with Kyle Bratcher, owner of Sickfoot Flies and regional fish biologist. And we're going to continue our series on the things that trout eat that are important to trout. Last time we talked about mayflies. This time we're going to talk about caddis. So let's stick to a similar format and start with the egg.
The egg. So honestly, it's not a whole lot different than a mayfly. Caddis aren't a whole lot different than the mayfly as far as how they lay their eggs. They're either going to lay them on the surface, and you'll see that with October caddis especially coming down in the fall, laying it in riffles. So You'll see them dabble down and then bump down a little ways and dabble down again. And so those eggs, same thing, sink to the bottom. They're not laying as many eggs as the mayflies. You're talking more like 800 tops instead of 3,000.
Okay.
And so they'll either lay them right on the surface. They'll look for emergent vegetation. They might lay it right on that, which emergent vegetation is plant matter that just barely sticks up or is maybe a little even subsurface. Or, again, and this is probably a little more common with caddisflies than it is with mayflies, they'll actually dive down and lay eggs on the surface of rocks and other stuff. And their eggs have some adhesion, so they'll stick to rocks and stuff. And
so that is
on the bottom.
Truly incredible that as a winged insect that they're able to dive and swim.
Yeah, with this stupid big old wing, how do you get down in the water when there's current and not just get your ass kicked?
Yeah. And there's definitely air that gets trapped in their wing. When they do that, they look shiny. I've seen them.
Yeah.
It seems like an easy target for a trout.
Yeah, and there is some trout patterns out there that people use to mimic that. And I mean, the wet fly is kind of a big part of that too.
I wonder if their eggs can survive digestion from a trout.
I have no answer to that.
Wouldn't that be interesting?
Yeah, I kind of doubt it. You think of something like that, it's pretty fragile.
Yeah.
You know, being that small, I kind of doubt that would be the case. Although they do have that same thing that we talked about with mayflies, is they have that pause they can put in that egg sometimes. So if conditions aren't quite right, they can actually delay the development of that egg if everything's not perfect and wait for it to develop. And you see that in like fairy shrimp and other stuff. And so maybe there's something to that.
What's a fairy shrimp?
A fairy shrimp is
Is that on Harry Potter?
I don't know if I can talk about fairy shrimp. Fairy shrimp are just a little crustacean that they're more like a mysis is what they kind of look like.
Okay.
They're kind of a weird creature that they exist in a lot of places where water doesn't exist year round. So where water will collect. So there's a fairy shrimp in southwest Oregon called the vernal pool fairy shrimp, which is a perfectly descriptive name. They live out on the desert floor, sagebrush and stuff. And there's these big, spots that are depressions, and water will collect there, and they'll hatch out, live for a few days, few weeks, and then do their thing, and then they'll lay their eggs, and then the pool will dry up. And those eggs can last for years in the sediment until there's more water and conditions are right again. And then they'll hatch out, and it can be years. And I actually found some fairy shrimp up in Dollar Lake a couple years ago.
Amazing.
And collected them and called the guy at Kansas University, Kansas? One of those. It's Kansas. It's all flat. Nobody cares.
Getting poorly spelled hate mail here.
Yeah. But yeah, they're kind of a weird little creature. Pretty much don't exist with fish. Fish wipe them out. So
Gotcha. Okay, so we're an egg. We got stuck to a rock or to some vegetation, and somehow this thing that formerly crawled around and now flew around managed to swim down to the bottom to lay those eggs. Amazing. But here we kind of separate from the mayfly because caddis have larvae, not nymphs.
yes.
So what's the difference between a larva and a nymph?
Well, the weird thing is it turns out that caddis are really closely related to butterflies and moths.
Really?
So, yeah, they branched off pretty close to each other. They're pretty much the two closest orders to each other. Or the next closest order to caddis is the butterflies.
Wow.
Which is interesting because the life cycle is actually fairly parallel. They have a larva, which if you think about it is almost akin to caterpillar. Obviously there's a few differences because caddises live under freaking water.
Yeah.
But there's a larval stage, and so those larvae, they're going to come out and they're going to, there's a few different ways they can go about living. They'll either burrow and create these little cavities in the ground, but most of us as anglers are familiar with the caddis that are case builders.
Right.
And a lot of them are going to do that, but they spin a silk, which is interesting, like a lot of other butterflies and moths. They spin a silk, and that's what they're building those cases out of.
And the silk is a saliva, right?
Yeah, and it's a gland next to their mouth, and they spin the silk, and they'll typically pick up twigs and rocks and whatever, and you can actually determine the genus based on the type of case they build. They're that specific. The case they build is actually dependent on the genus they're from. So you'll get into a river and you'll see a caddis that has built a case out of rocks versus one that's done those little square tubes out of grass and pine needles and that type of thing. And you can actually identify them just based on their case.
Wow.
So, which is interesting. They're pretty much the same thing as a mayfly. They eat, as far as food, their larvae are eating the same thing. They'll either eat detritus, which is dead.
Mm-hmm.
They'll eat paraphyton.
Paraphyton?
Yeah.
What? I don't know that word.
So
Nerd. What's paraphyton?
So typically you're going to see, mayflies are doing the same thing. Caddis, mayflies, there's a few different things you find on the bottom of a river. Detritus, which is typically dead things. It's dead and rotting.
Dead and decaying organic material.
Skin that's been sloughed off a fish, that kind of thing. Wood. Paraphyton is living. So it's algae, it's diatoms, it's...
Oh, really?
Cyanobacteria, diatomo, that kind of thing. So some of them will key on certain things. Some of them are predatory. So some of them will actually build a web out of their silk and catch drifting particles and then eat the drifting particles.
Like a spider.
Kind of almost exactly like a spider. Yeah. And so, but they're catching stuff that's just drifting down the river.
I had no idea they did that.
Yeah. And so there's a few species that'll do that. So it just depends on where you are. Don't ask me to get detailed on the species.
Are there as many species of caddis as there are of mayflies?
There's more.
There's more species of caddis.
More species of caddis than there are mayflies. So when we talked about mayflies, we talked about between 3,000 and 4,000 described species of mayflies with a few to go. Caddis flies, there's about 14,000 species.
Wow.
And so there's quite a few more. They're not as old as mayflies.
14,000?
Yeah.
So when we're talking about classifying insects, the taxonomy of it, I know that taxonomists are grouped into lumpers and splitters, right? Mm-hmm. So it sounds like the splitters got a hold of Caddis.
Well, and you got to figure out that also there's not that many people out there studying these. And so there's a little more latitude. Typically scientists get into arguments about this stuff, and then it whittles it down to what's pretty well accepted across the range. There's probably fewer people studying caddis flies specifically, and mayflies have been studied for quite a while. But the caddis flies, there's probably just a few people out there. Like there's probably 10 experts out there, right? And so it gives them a little more leeway. The one thing is, though, with aquatic animals and insects, macroinverts, is that they're not real good at dispersing across basins.
Right.
And so it's really easy for them to differentiate if they're in the Wallowa River versus in the Willamette River.
Yeah.
And the perfect example of that is there's a famous caddis in the Mackenzie River, a tributary of the Willamette, that is the Mackenzie green caddis. And it's a big caddis that hatches about this time of year, April. You tie them on like size 10s and they're green. And we don't have those here.
No.
And so, depending on conditions, they can differentiate by quite a bit, and it just depends on where they are. And they pretty much exist. Caddises are all over the world, again, everywhere but Antarctica.
Antarctica doesn't have any of these bugs.
No.
Crazy. So one thing about
you don't have the freshwater
right
ecosystems in Antarctica for them to exist.
Yeah. When I was on my way down here, ran through some caddis flies and had those little green balls on the windshield. And if anybody's ever experienced that, it'll look like just these little tiny green booger-looking things on your windshield. Do not hit your windshield wipers. That will turn into a cement that you have to take off with a razor blade or something. It's incredible. Yeah. But what that is the egg sac on a female caddis. So at this time of year, we're starting to get into the Mother's Day caddis, which is a really terrific hatch and fishing opportunity for early season. So that's one of the 14,000.
Yeah, that would be the American granum.
The American granum.
That is the one species that I know by actual species, common species name. Otherwise, it's angler names.
Right.
But that would be the American granum. And we, around here on the Wallowa River, we have a phenomenal hatch of those. And my experience with caddis hatches are very hit or miss on how good the fishing actually is. It seems like I hit a lot of caddis hatches that I think, oh, this is amazing, they're all over, and the fishing is garbage because the fish are satiated and it's just too hard to make yours stand out.
Yeah. So, well, we'll get into fishing here a little bit later, but I want to wrap up or continue with the life cycle. So this larval phase, do they still have an exoskeleton? Are they molting in order to get bigger?
So their front end has an exoskeleton, and it's hard. And then as you move back into the segments, so if you've ever grabbed a caddis and pulled it out of its case, which most of us have, as anglers, that front end is black, typically with legs and a head. And then as you move back, their bodies get soft, and they typically have 10 segments. And the first segment actually has a couple little appendages that help them hold on to their case. Mm-hmm. The second segment has little hooks that help them hold on even better.
Wow.
And so, when you pull them out of there, they need to be in there. That's their protection.
Yeah, they don't want to come out.
Yeah, and so their bodies are softer. But yeah, they go through a few different stages and kind of molt and grow. And as they grow, they add on to their case. For the case caddis, and they'll actually add on to that, and they can actually move around inside their case, so they can turn around and go back to the back end and trim it off if it's too long, and they can keep growing. Yeah, and that case will actually be open on both ends in the larval stage.
Okay.
And a lot of us will grab those cases and look at them, and they're not open on the back end, and we're like, well, what's true, right? Well, what's happening is those larvae, as they grow in that, they'll go through about a year for a caddis. We're not talking long lifespans. They'll go through about a year, and they'll grow, and they'll build that case bigger and bigger and bigger, and then eventually they'll attach it to a rock with their silk, and they'll seal it off on both ends. And that's when they go through metamorphosis. And so when we go back to the butterflies, it's the same thing as the caterpillar locking itself in a case and hanging from a tree and then going through their metamorphosis. And so caddis are going through the metamorphosis into the pupa stage, and then they'll emerge from that case.
So the pupal stage, it looks like they kind of have the beginnings of wings. Their legs are a little bit longer. They can swim.
Or crawl.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's the stage that they're not eating anymore, though. So as larvae, they eat all the periphyton and the detritus and maybe even predatory, move into their cocoon is essentially what it is. They lock off their case, and that becomes their cocoon, and they're just protected. And we all know we can roll over rocks and see those cases sitting on rocks. And then they'll emerge from that, and they'll either crawl to the banks or they'll swim straight to the surface once they emerge from that, and then they hatch out, and they'll use their shucks as a floating raft to get out and fly. And so one of the things that blew my mind with caddis, I was on the Yakima River, and it was one of these blizzard caddis hatches, and I was struggling to solve the puzzle of how to catch fish in this caddis hatch. And I'm fishing dry flies because I'm like, there's fish everywhere. There's dry flies, there's adults everywhere. And I started standing in the river, and I'm looking down, and around me I can see these caddis floating to the surface and hatching out and flying away on the top. And it was seconds on the surface before they were gone. And it was super interesting. So
amazing. Well, as adults, once they've emerged to the surface in that pupal phase and they've broken out of that exoskeleton and grown wings, caddis are pretty easy to identify because their wings sort of form up like an old school tent. Mm-hmm. They've got 4 wings, right? 2 sets.
Yeah.
2 sets of wings, 2 antennas. Yeah. They've still got 10 body segments. They do not have tails. Mm-mm. Right. So that's how you can kind of identify them. And then the way they fly is pretty erratic. It's described as flying like a drunken helicopter.
And everything I read on caddis says they're awful flyers.
Yeah.
It's like, they're bad at it. And so that's why they don't disperse very well.
Yeah. So part of that erratic nature in their behavior makes a caddis hatch a really good hatch for people to fish who aren't really experienced at finesse and dry fly fishing, because you can throw a really weird cast out there, and chances are that's going to emulate the really weird flying patterns of these caddis. And they're bombing down into the water, trying to break the surface tension so that they can swim in. And there can be a lot of caddis hatching all at once. You're talking about these blizzards. I've been in hatches where it was hard to breathe because there's just so many bugs around you, but they don't bite you. So like there's one thing to be overwhelmed by bugs that are biting you, and another thing that it's like you guys are just harmless, which is nice.
So, well, and the other thing is you might be on a river and have all these caddis around and think you're in a hatch. And the thing about caddis is they can live to a week or 2 after they hatch. And so you might not be in a hatch at that time. It might just be that they've been hanging out, breeding, doing their thing, and then they're super active at that time. And I've seen that a few times where there's no bugs coming off. And honestly, I think that's the better time to fish dry flies, is because the fish aren't under the surface eating pupa as they come up.
Yeah. And they don't molt as adults. Mayflies are the only insect that have 2 different phases of adulthood like that, where they'll go from that sub-imago to that imago phase down to spinner.
Yeah.
So then what happens? They breed, lay their eggs in the water, and that's where we started the story.
Yeah, we're kind of back to some of those females dive, which is incredible, but kind of back to the beginning. Yeah. So one of the things about them is they're another good indicator of stream health if they're around. They're a little better at living in water with less oxygen than mayflies and stoneflies are. And so if you're looking for decent water quality and river health, you'll have all 3 of those types of bugs in there. And they say typically with the caddis, if you're looking at those for an indicator, it should be multiple caddis species and not just one.
Yep.
And so the diversity is real important there.
Well, around here, they're a tremendous food source. We have so many caddis, and they start hatching this time of year. and we have them hatching all the way through November sometimes. They're really, really important food for trout, and because we have all these different occurrences of hatches, it makes a good fishing opportunity. So let's talk through some caddis flies that you like, some caddis patterns. So starting with caddis larva.
Oh, caddis larva. So as we talked during the mayfly episode, I don't get too picky about things. I got a couple that I like. There's one right now that I'm tying it's a real simple fly. It's a round pearl braid, and it's kind of an extended body on a small curved hook. It's green, and then it's got a black matte finish head bead, and then it's got some squirrel dubbing behind it and maybe a little peacock dubbing in it too, but that's it. And it's just this it's pretty larval. The other one I like, it's a Tom Rosenbauer pattern, or I heard about it from him, and he just takes different size of wire, different colors of wire, and he'll just wrap a hook with different colors and size of wire to emulate some of those cases that they're using the grass. And so I like that one too, and that one works pretty well. Typically a black head with a little bit of hackle of whatever color you want, but that's a great one too. Yeah, those are two of the ones that I really like. That pearl braid one I like to tie it in green typically, but I like the orange too. Yeah, some different colors. So,
what about the pupil face?
Well, I have a fly that I fish.
If you say something besides the Prince nymph, I'm gonna have words with you.
we're gonna have words. So I have a fly that I've been tying for since I started tying flies, which is about 12 years ago. That I like to say I came up with it. But there's one out there that's real similar, and it's called a Guide's Choice.
Yeah.
And I call mine the KB Special, but they're real similar, and all it is it's kind of a dumbed down hare's ear.
Yep.
It's a tail, hare's ear body, soft hackle, and a bead, and maybe a hot spot. I typically fish it with an orange hot spot. I also fish it in olive, and I fish that fly year round, almost no matter what. That's my go-to tie on, and it catches fish all year. I've caught steelhead on it. I've caught bull trout, whitefin. I mean, everything eats that fly. And so I think it looks probably most like a caddisfly pupa, but I think it probably represents a few other things too.
I have a bunch of those that you tied for me, and they're a fantastic fly. Yeah. And I'll troll them in the lake as well. Yeah. And do really well. So yeah, whenever you have good ingredients like that, it's almost like a pie. Like if you have nothing but good ingredients in a pie, the pie is probably going to turn out okay. And that's definitely the case with that fly. Okay, so what about dry flies?
Well, so here's a little tidbit that's interesting. So caddis are in the order Trichoptera, and it's Greek, meaning the direct translation would be hare wing. And it's called that. They're called that because their wings are kind of fuzzy, like butterflies and stuff. But I think it's interesting because probably the most famous caddisfly pattern dry fly is an elk hair caddis.
Right.
And I just don't see any way you can really beat that. I tie some versions of it and a few things that are a little different, but almost everything with that hair wing like that, with the deer hair or the elk hair caddis is my go-to. I do tie a couple others that with like Zelon wings that float a little lower in the water, and then tie some hackle up front. But those are probably the top two in my book.
Yeah. So it's interesting when we're talking about mayflies, you can't talk about mayfly nymphs without talking about the pheasant tail. And you can't talk about caddis without talking about the elk hair caddis. And they were both invented by the same guy. His name was Al Troth, and he lived in Dillon, Montana. And he was a really interesting character, very, very precise in what his expectations were of himself, but also of his clients. And he was still around when I showed up on the scene there, and you could hear him yelling at clients from a quarter river mile away. If they messed up a cast, they were going to hear about it. And he was pretty abusive as a guide like that. But it's also interesting that the number one selling dry fly and the number one selling nymph are both his patterns.
Huh.
So he had a level of genius that is unsurpassed in the realm of fly tying. And they're both flies that drew most of their ingredients from a single animal. So the pheasant tail is primarily from pheasant tail fibers, and the elk hair caddis is primarily from elk hair. The thing that I really love about an elk hair caddis is the way the wire holds down the hackle. It makes that fly so resilient. You can catch a lot of fish on it before that fly falls apart. It's just a tough fly.
Yep. Last summer I had up in the mountains here, I had a elk hair caddis that I had tied in like a size 14, and I caught 10 brook trout on it. And then
Which have teeth like a velociraptor.
yeah, and then I had to hike out, so I cut it off, stuck it in my hat, came home, and I was sitting at my desk, and I had set my hat down, and I looked at that thing, and I was like, gosh. And I pulled that out and started looking at it, and I was like, this thing looks like I could sell this still.
Yeah.
I'm like, it still looks like it was just tied. And
Yeah.
I caught 10 brook trout on it, and I was like, yeah, just awesome fly. So floats well, easy to cast.
So since we're talking about this, there's this extra level of caddis in our area, which is the October caddis, and they're hatching at the same time that our steelhead are showing up. And because of that, it creates this opportunity for fishing dry flies for steelhead. And you can fish dry flies for steelhead in places where there are no bugs hatching at all. Mm-hmm. But when you have these big orange caddis flies fluttering around on the surface of the water, it really does help. And the Grand Ronde is a fantastic fishery, all things considered, for dry fly fishing for steelhead. And then we're talking about skating flies. So when we get into skating, what's your go-to there?
That's a good question.
A lot of guys like a muddler minnow.
Well, I tie a fly that's real similar to a muddler minnow. It's just a little sparser. Mm-hmm. And, I tie it with orange and a big deer head on it, and a spun deer hair head on it. And that's what I would go to. It's not complicated. It's pretty simple, and it's basically just a muddler minnow, though. It's not anything special. I don't know that you really need anything super special for that. I kind of like it when they submerge a little and then come back to the surface and kind of get it in and out a little bit. I think that action helps, but something with that big heavy deer hair head on it that keeps it afloat. Maybe it'll pull it under depending on the current. Turkey hair wing, but orange. And you tie them on a steelhead hook, so they're a little different than the typical muddler that you think of for trout. But yeah,
that is such an exciting way to fish if a fish will ever play ball with you.
Yeah, and I've had a few times that I've pulled into a run in my drift boat and looked downstream, and I saw a fish come up and hit the surface. And sometimes you see them just kind of porpoise, and I don't think those fish were really feeding, but like these fish, they came up, and then you saw caudal fin sweep upstream, and it's like, so they're coming up and they're hitting something and turning.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh. And so immediately you go to a skater of some kind and hop in that run and, give it a few shots, and, a lot of times you'll come up with fish. So
yeah, it's an exciting time of year, and you're going to pick up trout, and everything gets really stimulated by the way that caddis goes across the surface.
Yeah.
What are we missing?
Let's talk about those blizzard caddis hatches.
Okay. So if you're in a straight up caddis blitz and there are bugs everywhere, crawling all over you, back of your neck, on your hands, they're crawling on your rod, what do you do? How do you even approach that situation? So
for me, I've had some times where it's just impossible. I've tried everything. Can't get anything to happen. I think when it's like that, the best thing to do is go subsurface and fish things like sparkle pupas, and even swing them to the surface, like we talked about in the mayfly episode. Do your nymph drift out and then let them swing up and get down in those fish's face, give them something they can see. Because I think those fish have typically, if there's that many bugs on the water, they've already eaten a lot of them. So they're either not hungry anymore, and they need it down their face because they're probably not going to move to the surface to eat. And so that's how I've approached that situation. It's been pretty rare that it's been good dry fly fishing in those situations. So, or I just go completely away from the caddis and fish something like a stonefly and something that's big, or a woolly bugger under an indicator, and hope it's just something that's in their face enough that they'll eat.
Yeah. I've also had success adding split shot to dry flies and getting that presentation of an elk hair caddis descending.
Sure.
And picked fish up doing that. But you have to do something outside of the dead drift of what a million other caddis are doing.
And what a lot of people don't do anymore is swing soft tackles.
Yep.
And I think there's an opportunity there because it's going to look different than anything else that's in the water. And it's going to have that profile of an adult caddis laying an egg. And so I think that's another opportunity, is get a soft tackle down to them and swing it across and get them a little more excited.
Yep, good opportunity for a lighter rod and a longer light rod. So like an 8.5 or 9 foot 3 weight. That's a great rod for swinging these soft tackles, and don't neglect your upstream presentations. A hand twist retrieve and tying on 2 or 3 soft tackles with an anchor fly on the bottom, a bigger one, will really generate some responses from these trout that you might not otherwise get. But you can't just be another one in the herd and hope that your lottery number comes up, because it's just not the way the game is played.
Yeah, it's a different thing when you've got a fish that's when you've got a lot of bugs on the water and you've got fish that are in that rhythmic rise.
Yep.
And you're just waiting for it to be timed right because you know where they are. This is fishing under the surface, just trying to be different. It's really hard to do, and there's that many bugs out. So,
okay, Kyle. So if somebody wants to order a Caddis kit, a kit that has 4 different patterns in it, that wherever they're going to go, one of these is probably going to work during a caddis hatch. What are the flies? What are the sizes?
Best thing to do is let me know what time of year it's going to be.
Okay.
Because that could dictate what that fly is going to look like. But I do offer a Mother's Day caddis starter kit on my website that's got, I don't remember if it's a dozen flies or a few more, that you can just buy that.
Great gift for mom.
Yeah, great gift for mom, or take your mom fishing. Or I can tie whatever you'd like, so custom flies. I have a number of caddis patterns on the website that aren't in that kit, so I'm not a real stickler on that kit, so there's a lot of caddis patterns on the website that if you want them to go in that kit instead of what I have offered, I'm willing to do that too. So any nice. Caddis fly out there that you want in any kind of pattern, I can do it. So any kind of hook.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to our next installment in the series, which is going to be the stonefly. But that's a wrap for Caddis. If you guys have any questions, feel free to look up Sickfoot Flies on either the interwebs or the Instagram, and Kyle can hook you up with all of his knowledge. Till next time.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the show. I would also like to thank Kyle for sharing his knowledge. This episode was edited by Emily Brannigan, with original music written and performed by Justin Hay. Artwork for the Six Ranch podcast was created by John Chatterlin of Yellow Rose Tattoo in Salt Lake City, and digitized by Celia Christofferson. If you enjoyed the show, I encourage you to share it with a friend and subscribe. You can find photos and more content on Instagram at Six Ranch Podcast. We will be back with the next portion of our insect series next Friday. Have a great weekend, and don't forget to go catch a fish.